There's something about being alone in the woods that strips away all the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about safety, about how thin the barriers really are between us and whatever's out there in the dark. I'm going to tell you about Sarah Chen, a software engineer from Portland, who learned this lesson in the worst possible way. This happened just last October, up at Devil's Creek Campground in the Cascade Foothills. I know because I was the ranger who found her car 3 days later, keys still dangling from the ignition, engine running, driver's door hanging wide open like she'd bolted from something in pure terror. Sarah had driven up there to heal, you understand, fresh off a brutal breakup that had left her questioning everything about her life, her judgment, her ability to trust her own instincts. She'd always been the type to overthink every decision, to second-guess herself into paralysis. But after Marcus had cheated on her with her own sister, she'd decided she needed to prove something to herself. That she could be alone, that she could rely on her own strength, that she didn't need anyone. So she'd packed her small 2-person REI tent, her sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, and driven the winding Forest Service road to Devil's Creek, where the nearest ranger station sat 12 miles away, and cell towers might as well have been on Mars. The campground had that particular autumn beauty that makes your chest ache with longing for something you can't quite name. Towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks created a cathedral ceiling of green and gold, their branches filtering the late afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns across the forest floor. Sword ferns carpeted the understory in thick prehistoric abundance, and somewhere in the distance, Devil's Creek itself whispered secrets to the moss-covered stones in its bed. Sarah had chosen site number 7, tucked back against a natural amphitheater of trees that promised privacy and protection from the wind that had started picking up as evening approached. But even as she unpacked her gear, something felt off. Not wrong exactly, just off. The way a song sounds when it's played in a slightly different key than you remember. The silence was too complete, too heavy, as if the forest were holding its breath. No bird calls, no chittering of squirrels, no rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Just the whisper of wind through the canopy, and the distant murmur of water over stone. Sarah told herself she was being ridiculous, that the breakup had left her jumpy and paranoid, seeing threats where none existed. But as she hammered in her tent stakes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. That's when she found the boot print. It was there in the soft earth near what would be the head of her tent, pressed deep into the damp soil like whoever made it had been standing there for a long time, shifting their weight from foot to foot. The print was easily a size 12, maybe 13, far too large for Sarah's size 7 hiking boots. She stared at it for a long moment, her rational mind cataloguing possible explanations. Previous camper, park maintenance, day hiker who'd wandered off the trail. All perfectly reasonable. But something about the print's placement bothered her. The way it pointed directly toward where her tent door would be, as if someone had stood there watching, waiting, planning. As she worked to set up camp, that sensation of being observed only intensified. Every time she bent to adjust a guy line or arrange her gear, the skin between her shoulder blades would prickle with awareness. She'd straighten up quickly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing except the swaying shadows cast by the late afternoon sun. Once, while she was filtering water from the creek, she heard something that might have been laughter, drifting through the trees, high and musical and completely out of place in the wilderness silence. When she called out a tentative hello, her voice seemed swallowed by the forest, and the only response was the sudden crack of a branch somewhere in the darkness between the trees. By the time she had her campfire crackling and her dinner heating over the flames, full darkness had settled over Devil's Creek like a heavy blanket. The fire created a small bubble of warmth and light that only served to make the surrounding darkness seem deeper and more absolute. Sarah sat on her camp chair, spooning lukewarm chili from a can, and trying to convince herself that she was enjoying the solitude, the peace, the chance to think without distraction. But every few minutes, her eyes would be drawn to the edge of the firelight, where the shadows seemed to shift and move in ways that had nothing to do with the dancing flames. That's when she heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. circling her campsite at the very edge of audibility. The sound would fade in and out, sometimes seeming to come from her left, sometimes from behind her, as if whoever was out there was moving through the trees just beyond the reach of the firelight. Sarah sat perfectly still, her spoon halfway to her mouth, straining to listen. The footsteps would stop for long minutes, then resume, always maintaining that careful distance, that perfect positioning just outside her sight. She called out again, her voice stronger this time, more demanding. "Who's there? Hello? Is someone out there?" But the forest swallowed her words without echo. And the footsteps stopped completely. For perhaps 20 minutes she sat in perfect silence, watching the shadows, waiting for some sign of movement. When nothing came, she convinced herself it had been her imagination, her paranoia, the way unfamiliar sounds can seem threatening when you're alone in the dark. She banked her fire, brushed her teeth and crawled into her tent, zipping the door firmly shut behind her. The tent had always been her refuge, her private space. But tonight it felt different. The thin nylon walls that had always seemed adequate, now felt gossamer thin. A barrier that could be breached by anything with claws or determination. She lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the forest sounds, trying to distinguish between the normal creaks and sighs of trees settling for the night, and something more purposeful, more directed. For a while there was nothing but wind and the distant sound of water, and she began to relax, to drift towards sleep. That's when she felt the first touch. Just a gentle pressure against the tent wall near her head, as if someone had reached out and pressed their palm against the fabric. The pressure moved slowly along the wall, tracing a path from her pillow toward the foot of the tent, the nylon dimpling inward with each deliberate touch. Sarah lay frozen, her heart hammering so loud she was sure whoever was outside could hear it. The touching stopped for a moment, then resumed, this time on the opposite wall, the same slow, exploratory movement, as if hands were mapping the outline of her body through the thin barrier. Then came the sound that made her blood freeze in her veins, the metallic whisper of her tent zipper, being slowly, carefully drawn down. Not ripped or torn, but opened with infinite patience, tooth by tooth, as if whoever was outside didn't want to wake her, wanted to maintain the pretense that this was all perfectly normal. Sarah watched in paralyzed horror, as the zipper descended inch by inch, revealing a growing triangle of absolute darkness beyond. When it was halfway open, it stopped, and she heard something that might have been breathing, slow and regular, and far too close to her head. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she lay there in perfect stillness, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might attract the attention of whatever was crouched just outside her tent. Eventually, exhaustion and adrenaline crash combined to pull her into a fitful sleep, and when she woke with the first grey light of dawn, the zipper was closed again, sealed tight as if it had never been opened at all. She might have convinced herself it was all a dream, except for what she found pressed into the floor of her tent near the door. A wet footprint, perfectly clear in the condensation that had formed on the tent floor overnight. The same size 12 boot print she'd found in the dirt the day before, but this one was inside her tent, just inches from where her head had been resting. The rational part of her mind scrambled for explanations. She must have stepped in something wet when she'd gone to the bathroom during the night, though she had no memory of leaving the tent. Maybe she'd tracked in moisture on her boots before sealing herself in for the night. But even as she tried to convince herself, she knew the footprint wasn't hers. The tread pattern was wrong, the size was wrong, and the placement was impossible unless someone had been standing over her while she slept. She broke camp quickly that morning, telling herself she was going to explore the area, maybe find a more comfortable spot to set up for her second night. But really, she was looking for explanations, for some sign of who or what had been visiting her tent in the darkness. The forest seemed different in daylight, less threatening but somehow more watchful, as if eyes were tracking her movement from behind every tree trunk and fern frond. She followed a game trail that wound away from the main campground, deeper into the old growth, hoping to find some clue that would make sense of the previous night's terror. What she found was worse than no explanation at all. Perhaps a quarter mile from her campsite, in a small clearing surrounded by towering cedars, she discovered the remnants of another camp. But this wasn't the neat, organized setup of an experienced camper. This looked like a disaster zone, like something had torn through the campsite, with deliberate fury. A sleeping bag hung in shreds from the low branch of a madrone tree, its down fillings scattered across the forest floor like snow. A camp chair was overturned and twisted, its aluminum frame bent into impossible angles. Most disturbing of all was the fire ring, where the stones had been arranged in a perfect circle around what looked like the charred remains of camping gear, clothing, and something else she didn't want to identify. The trees around the clearing were marked with what looked like claw marks. Deep gouges in the bark that spiraled around the trunks from ground level to perhaps 8 feet high. But as Sarah looked more closely, she realized they weren't claw marks at all. They were too regular, too purposeful, carved with something sharp and metallic. And some of them formed shapes, patterns that made her stomach clench with recognition. Stick figures hanging from crude gallows, a tent with a body sprawled in front of it. And scratched into the bark of the largest cedar, in letters that looked fresh despite the weather staining, a single word that made her turn and run back toward her own campsite. Sarah, a name carved in the bark of a tree a quarter mile from where she'd chosen to camp, in a clearing that looked like the site of some unspeakable violence. She ran through every rational explanation her panicked mind could generate. Coincidence? Another Sarah who'd camped here before? Some sick joke by local kids who somehow knew she was coming? But even as she tried to convince herself, she knew she was grasping at straws. Someone had been expecting her. Someone had been waiting. She should have left then. Should have packed up her gear, loaded her car, and driven straight back to Portland without looking back. That's what any sensible person would have done, and for a moment, standing at the edge of her campsite with her car keys in her hand, that's exactly what she intended to do. But then she thought about Marcus, about the way he'd looked at her when he'd said she was too weak, too dependent, too afraid of everything to ever really live. She thought about all the time she'd backed down from challenges, chosen the safe path, let other people make decisions for her because she was too scared to trust her own judgment. Not this time. This time she was going to see it through, going to prove to herself that she could face whatever was out there in the dark and come out stronger. She was going to spend one more night at Devil's Creek, and then she'd leave on her own terms, not running away but walking away victorious. It was a decision that nearly cost her everything, and might have cost her more than that if she hadn't been very, very lucky. She spent the afternoon trying to act normal, reading a paperback novel in her camp chair, heating soup over her camp stove, even taking a short nap in the tent with the door wide open to prove to herself that she wasn't afraid. But as the sun began its descent toward the tree line, that familiar dread settled over her like fog rolling in from the coast. The forest sounds seemed muted again, that unnatural silence that she now recognized as a warning. She built up her fire higher than the night before, arranging her camp chair so that her back was to the flames, and she had an unobstructed view of the tree line in every direction. The footsteps started earlier this time, beginning even before full darkness had settled over the campground. The same slow, deliberate circling, but closer now, more confident. Sometimes she could catch glimpses of movement between the trees, a shadow that seemed too tall and too angular to be human, but moved with human purpose and intelligence. The circling continued for hours, sometimes stopping for long periods that were somehow more terrifying than the movement, because she never knew when it would resume, never knew which direction the next sound would come from. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped entirely, and for a moment Sarah allowed herself to hope that whatever was out there had finally given up and moved on. That's when she heard her own voice calling to her from the darkness beyond the firelight. Sarah, it called, the voice perfect in every inflection and tone, as if she were listening to a recording of herself. "Sarah, come out here, I want to show you something." The voice moved as it spoke, circling her campsite just as the footsteps had done, staying always at the very edge of audibility. She knew it wasn't her voice, knew it was impossible, but the similarity was so exact that it made her question her own sanity. The voice called to her for nearly an hour, sometimes pleading, sometimes demanding, sometimes whispering sweet promises about what it wanted to show her in the darkness between the trees. Sarah huddled by her fire, feeding it stick after stick of dead wood, keeping the flames high and bright against the surrounding dark. She'd read somewhere that most predators avoided fire, but she was no longer sure she was dealing with any kind of predator that could be found in nature guides or wildlife management textbooks. When she finally retreated to her tent sometime after 2 in the morning, she lay fully clothed on top of her sleeping bag, a heavy maglite flashlight clutched in one hand and her camp knife in the other. She'd left the rain fly off the tent so that the thin mesh walls would give her better visibility, and she lay there staring up through the mesh at the canopy of stars visible between the tree branches. For a while there was blessed silence, and she began to think that maybe she'd won. Maybe her show of defiance had convinced whatever was out there to find easier prey. That's when the hands began pressing against the tent walls. Not 1 or 2, but dozens of them, maybe more, pressing against every surface of the tent from ground level to the peak of the roof. The mesh dimpled inward under the pressure, and Sarah could see the clear outline of palms and fingers pushing against the fabric from every direction. But these weren't normal hands. They were too long, the fingers extending well beyond what human proportions should allow, and they moved with a fluid, boneless quality that made her skin crawl with revulsion. The hands pressed and kneaded at the tent walls for long minutes, and Sarah realized with growing horror that they seemed to be trying to map her position, feeling for her body heat, her breath, the outline of her form inside the tent. When she shifted position, the hands would follow, concentrating their attention wherever she moved, as if they were learning the shape and substance of her fear. Through it all she could hear breathing, dozens of different rhythms and timbres, as if a crowd of watchers surrounded her tent, all waiting for something, all focused on her with predatory intensity. Then came the sound that finally broke her paralysis. The whisper of fabric tearing, slow and deliberate, as claws or knives began to slice through the tent walls in perfectly straight lines. Not random destruction, but careful, methodical cutting, as if whatever was outside was preparing to peel back her shelter like the skin of an orange. Sarah exploded into action, grabbing her flashlight and knife and tearing open the tent zipper in one violent motion. She burst out of the tent ready to fight, ready to face whatever nightmare had been tormenting her for 2 endless nights. The clearing was empty. No figures lurking in the shadows, no eyes reflecting her flashlight beam. No sign of the dozens of hands that had been pressing against her tent walls just moments before. But as she swept her light in a full circle around her campsite, she saw something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Scattered throughout the forest around her campsite, barely visible in the darkness between the trees, were dozens of tents. All of them identical to hers, the same model, the same color, the same size, arranged in perfect rows that extended back into the forest as far as her flashlight beam could penetrate. She approached the nearest tent with trembling steps, her knife held out in front of her like a talisman against the impossible. The tent was zipped shut, but she could see through the mesh that there was something inside, the vague outline of camping gear arranged just as hers had been. She reached out with a shaking hand and drew down the zipper, revealing a sleeping bag, a backpack, a camp stove, all identical to her own equipment. But there were differences, subtle wrongnesses, that made her stomach lurch with vertigo. The sleeping bag was the right color but the wrong fabric, too smooth, too reflective, like it was made of something that had never seen the inside of a factory. The backpack was the right shape but covered in pockets that seemed to shift and multiply when she wasn't looking directly at them. She moved to the next tent, and the next, finding the same disturbing similarities and differences in each one. Her gear but not her gear, as if something had been trying to recreate her campsite from memory and getting the details slightly wrong each time. In some tents she found equipment that was clearly from other campers, other victims. A sleeping bag with a floral pattern that no outdoor gear company had ever manufactured. A camp stove that seemed to be made of the same metal as her own but was somehow the wrong shape, too angular, too organic, like it had grown rather than been built. As she moved deeper into the forest of duplicate tents, her flashlight beam began to reveal more disturbing details. Some of the tents showed signs of violence. Long tears in the fabric that had been roughly sewn back together with what looked like sinew or plant fiber. Others were stained with dark patches that could have been mud or blood, or something worse. And in one tent near the back of the collection, she found something that made her turn and run without stopping to close the zipper behind her. It was her own driver's license, her credit cards, her insurance card, all arranged neatly on a camp table that was identical to the one she'd left back at her own campsite. But the photo on the license was wrong, showing her face but with eyes that were too wide, too dark, as if they'd been colored in with ink. The signature on the credit cards was hers, but written in a handwriting she didn't recognize, too perfect, too controlled, like something had been practicing her signature for years without quite getting it right. She ran through the forest with branches whipping at her face and roots trying to trip her feet, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs in her desperate flight back to her own campsite. But when she finally burst into the clearing where she'd spent the last 2 nights, she stopped short, confusion and terror warring in her chest. There was her tent, exactly where she'd left it, but also somehow different, as if she was seeing it through a distorting lens. The proportions seemed slightly off, the color a shade too bright, the guidelines arranged in patterns that her rational mind insisted were the same but her instincts screamed were somehow wrong. She grabbed her car keys from the tent and ran for her Honda Civic, not bothering to pack her gear, not caring about anything except getting away from Devil's Creek and the nightmare forest of duplicate tents. The engine turned over on the first try, and she reversed out of her campsite so fast that she nearly collided with one of the firing posts. As she spun the wheel and pointed the car toward the Forest Service road that would take her back to civilization, her headlight swept across her abandoned campsite one last time. The tent was gone. Not packed up, not collapsed, but simply absent, as if it had never existed at all. In its place was a perfect circle of bare earth, swept clean of pine needles and debris, with a single boot print pressed deep into the center. A size 12 print, pointing directly at her fleeing car. Sarah drove through the night without stopping, her hands locked on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the narrow cone of illumination cast by her headlights. She didn't trust herself to look in the rearview mirror, didn't trust what she might see following her down the winding mountain road. It wasn't until she was back in Portland, sitting in her apartment with every light turned on, and her back pressed against the locked front door, that she allowed herself to believe she'd escaped whatever had been stalking her in the forest. But safety, she learned, is a more fragile thing than most of us realize. That first night back in her own bed, exhausted beyond measure but afraid to close her eyes, she finally drifted off, sometime near dawn. She woke to the sound she'd hoped never to hear again, the metallic whisper of a zipper being slowly drawn down, tooth by careful tooth. But she was in her apartment, in her own bed, with solid walls around her and deadbolts on her doors. There were no zippers in her bedroom, nothing that could make that particular sound, except when she opened her eyes she wasn't in her apartment anymore. She was lying in a tent, staring up at nylon walls that were slowly, methodically being opened from the outside. Through the growing gap in the fabric, she could see not the familiar darkness of Devil's Creek, but something far worse. Dozens of faces pressed close to the opening, all wearing her own features but wrong somehow, too symmetrical, too perfect, like photographs that had been retouched by someone who didn't quite understand human anatomy. She tried to scream, tried to move, tried to do anything but lie there paralyzed as the zipper reached the bottom and the tent walls fell away entirely, revealing that she was surrounded by an endless field of identical tents stretching away in all directions under a starless sky. The faces began to speak in unison, using her own voice, her own words, welcoming her home, telling her how long they'd been waiting for her to join them, explaining how much better it would be now that she didn't have to pretend to be human anymore. Sarah woke up in her own bed, in her own apartment, with morning sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. But on her nightstand, where she was certain she'd left nothing, was a single pine needle, still damp with dew, and the faint but unmistakable smell of wood smoke and forest earth clinging to her sheets. When people ask me about camping safety, about what precautions they should take when they're heading out into the wilderness alone, I tell them about bears and mountain lions, about proper food storage and water purification, and the importance of letting someone know where you're going. But I never tell them about Sarah Chen, about what she found at Devil's Creek, about the tent cities that might be waiting in the deep woods where no trails go and no maps mark the territory. Some warnings are too big, too impossible to believe until you're living them, and by then it's usually too late to do anything but run and hope you're faster than whatever's chasing you. But I will tell you this, and you can take it or leave it as you see fit. If you're ever camping alone, and you hear footsteps circling your tent in the darkness, and you find boot prints that aren't yours pressed into the soft earth around your campsite, don't try to be brave. Don't try to prove anything to yourself or anyone else. Pack up your gear and get out of there as fast as your feet can carry you, because some things in the woods are older and stranger and hungrier than anything you learned about in biology class. And if you're lying in your tent some night and you hear your own voice calling to you from the darkness outside, promising to show you something wonderful, promising to make everything better if you'll just come out and join the conversation, remember that the only voice you can truly trust is the one inside your head telling you to run. Because when you're alone in the wilderness, there's only one thin sheet of nylon between you and whatever's out there in the dark, and sometimes, what's out there has been practicing being you for longer than you've been alive.